Hello, Skylar Poole here to talk to you guys about the week 15 readings about rebel governance. And I want to start off with a quick summary of the articles and then kind of jump into the common themes and some of the overlapping things that happen in these readings for this week. And I want to start with Aranya with the chapter that presents the social order, the theory about social order and civil war. And the argument in this chapter is that there are three possible outcomes for when a community of civilians interacts with an armed group of rebels. And those three possible outcomes is either disorder, alleocracy, or rebelocracy. And depending on a couple of different factors, you're going to get one of the three. And there are two major factors that influence kind of the direction of interaction between these rebel groups and civilians, according to the chapter. And the first one is being time horizon. And this is one of those kind of common themes throughout the readings that I'll get to in a little bit. With time horizon, basically, if there is a group that has long-term time horizons, so those who have an end goal and they are really pushing for this end goal, striving to get to this certain accomplishment, not necessarily as quickly as possible, but they are striving for their main goal. Those will be the ones that will develop rebelocracy in areas under their control. So they'll be able to gain some influence in some of these regions. However, continuing with time horizon, those that will with short-term kind of time horizons that do the quick, I guess, justification or like the quick spoils, if you will, those groups will not really be able to kind of develop this rule over communities, and that will lead to disorder according to the chapter. And the second factor in determining which of these three outcomes a rebel group will get is that of the pre-existing local institutions, specifically the quality of those local institutions. And this is also a common theme in the readings that we've had for this week. And so if there are local institutions, whether it's economic, social, political platforms, whatever, these will determine how the rebels would attempt to interact with some of the civilians in these areas. Civilians have a agency if these local institutions are really developed, such as those local dispute institutions that are mentioned in the chapter, those kind of formal and informal rules for contracts, disputes, property rights, things of that nature. If those are set in place well and the civilians in the region really follow these local dispute institutions or then these other kind of more general political economic institutions, that will allow the civilians some agency, and they can also resist rebel rules to some degree if they would like to. So it adds a little bit of mobility, agency to civilians, and it will help civilians kind of get into places of political, I don't want to say power, but political influence with these rebels, just because it's a easier kind of merger of the two. Um, Moving on to Weinstein. Again, Weinstein's argument is that the group structure of rebels and like the internal social structure, the composition of who is in these rebel groups is still a really big factor in the argument for rebel governance. And we see that again with Weinstein. And Weinstein's overarching argument is all about bargaining, making deals with civilians if you're a rebel government. And then on the flip side, civilians making deals with rebels. And Weinstein says that there are three factors that shape the incentives to strike bargains. They're very similar to some of the main themes, obviously, in this reading. You have the stake in productivity, time horizons, which is reoccurring, and then the capacity to credibly commit to an agreement. So like the ability to actually rebels to either hold true to their word or like really enforce these agreements that are being put into place with civilians. And Weinstein goes on to use examples from various groups around the world and how they were successful in some of these areas or unsuccessful in some of the other areas that we've talked about. But again, time horizons is also one of those reoccurring things that's mentioned in most of the readings. Continuing down, just quick summaries again. Manfly and Stewart, they take a little bit different approach than the previously two readings, and they show that there is a step-by-step type of process that could lead to a number of different outcomes, depending on which steps and how these organizations kind of come together and how they interact with civilians. They argue that there are 4 dimensions that could vary depending on the group or the conflict. You have power sharing as one, integration, innovation, and inclusiveness. And the big argument from these authors is that it is a kind of step-by-step process. It's sequential. And so you have to have power sharing first, and then that leads to integration, innovation, and then inclusiveness. And then you get this kind of civilian rebel governance kind of mixture between the two. And they also cite examples of how some rebel groups were able to power share where others won't, and how some were able to really include people in the local from the local population in these political systems that these rebels are trying to set up. And Loyal shows the importance of judicial processes under rebel authority, specifically with trials and court systems. And the main argument of the article is that when a rebel group needs civilian support, they'll use the judicial process that they've kind of created to address grievances that have happened upon that civilian population, or grievances that people within the rebel organization have committed. And so that will then help this rebel organization kind of gain support from the civilians within the area as they use these judicial systems. On the other side, and on the other kind of continuing argument that the article addresses, is that when a rebel group needs to demonstrate strength, they'll use judicial processes like trials, and that will show that the rebels have legitimate authority, their word is law, and they can carry out crime and punishment if need be. And so these trials can show the civilians that the rebels are in charge, they have a functioning government, and they're capable of carrying out rule of law. Both very, very important. And Loyal, they proved their hypothesis in their experience in the experiment, and they also conclude that pre-existing levels of civilian support is a really big predictor of the strategies that rebel groups will use to maintain or increase support if need be. So again, we have the use of courts, trials, and then also the pre-existing conditions that have been mentioned in other articles as well, all playing a really key role in the strategy that these rebel groups choose to implement once they gain control of a local population. So with the quick summaries out of the way, real quick, there are some really common kind of threads between the 4 articles that we read. One is the role of civilian agency. This is huge. Most of the articles preface that like civilians or rebel groups are in need of civilian support. They have to have some degree of civilian support, and if they can't get that, odds are they're not going to be successful. And the civilian really has agency when it comes time for the rebels to govern if these pre-existing conditions, if they are in place that benefit the civilians. So if there's actively working economics, political kind of realms of jurisdiction that civilians have, it makes the rebels really think about including civilians in their rule of law, which in turn benefits the civilians. And then time horizons was another common theme throughout the readings as well. This kind of goes back to the argument that rebels they do things because of the character of their organization, like who is in the rebel organization, how are they kind of controlled, and things of that nature. If you have a rebel group with a long kind of time horizon, they'll be more willing to kind of play the long game, if you will, and really try and build some of these institutions for governance. Whereas the short time horizons, those types of rebels, they probably will not, and will kind of exploit the population just because they don't have this long kind of in-game governing type mentality within the organization. Of course, courts, building courts, maintaining courts, judicial institutions play a key role throughout all of it because this is obviously all about rebel governance. And so the readings show that rebel groups are dependent, at least in some cases, on civilians, and the civilians can benefit from local pre-existing conditions when it comes time to try and create a bargain with rebel groups. And so there really is strategy involved for both the rebels and how to deal with civilians and actually make a governing body possible, and then also strategy on the civilians on how much they can kind of gain influence in this newly formed government, and that also could protect them from violence and maybe even help them in their agency and things of that nature. So the readings were very interesting, lots of very good arguments in them, and thank you for your time.